Protesters across the country, including some in Fall River, came together over the weekend to demand an end to stay-at-home orders. They were a clear violation of social distancing rules. And while the president has largely backed such guidelines in his daily briefings, at the same time, he's been egging on protesters on Twitter with calls to liberate Minnesota, Michigan, and Virginia, and claiming the Second Amendment is under siege. In a recent interview, Yale forensic psychiatrist Dr. Bandy Lee likened the protesters to child soldiers who could ultimately turn into, quote, armed troops in the streets if the president doesn't win re-election. Dr. Lee is also the author of Violence, and she edited the book The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, which is a compilation of the writings of a few dozen psychiatrists and others on the mental health condition of the president. She joins me now. Dr. Lee, thanks so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Let me read you a few things you've said and written about the President of the United States. He's so severely mentally troubled that he is a great danger to the nation. His mental impairments would not only render him incapable, but he would be compelled to make harmful decisions. He's mentally compromised. What caused you to reach those conclusions, Doctor?
Well, first of all, I speak for myself and not for my institutions. Mm-hmm. I have been studying violent behavior for quite some time as a specialty, in fact, for 20 years. And what I noticed in the behavior of the president is what I have seen in the dynamics of individuals who become violent, as well as those who provoke violence in others and also interact with their followers in dangerous ways. And that was one of the reasons why I felt the need to speak up to the public when I put together the book years ago now.
But you know far better than I that mental illness and incapacity are not the same thing. A lot of your colleagues around the world have suggested that many of our presidents, most notably the greatest president of them all, suffered from mental illness, severe depression, Abraham Lincoln. So even if you believe he is mentally compromised, his health is, do you believe that compromise equals incapacity on the part of President Trump?
Well, when I'm speaking of mental compromise, I am speaking of incapacity, not necessarily a diagnosis of mental illness. And you're absolutely right in that mental illness does not define incapacity. In fact, it almost has nothing to do with dangerousness either. But mental incapacity means that someone does not have the mental makeup or the resources to be able to deal with problems in a rational and reality-based way. And when someone lacks capacity, one has difficulty taking in information, taking in advice, processing that information, and making sound, rational decisions. And those are the kinds of things we are seeing in the president. And that itself does not have anything to do with mental illness.
Are there specific examples of late that you think rise to the level that cause you to reach those kind of conclusions, Dr. Lee?
Yes, we have plenty of evidence. In fact, the Muller report gave us abundant and high quality information of the best sort that we look for when we're evaluating incapacity. So incapacity to fulfill the duties of one's office means that he would be incapable of making rational decisions. And we had exactly the type of information that we would need in abundance from his coworkers and associates who have worked closely with him and interacted with him. And all their reports under sworn testimony gave us plentiful information. So we were able to come to that conclusion and have made the conclusion as a public service, as well as made recommendations to Congress members.
When you say recommendations, you have drafted, along with some of your colleagues recently, something called a prescription for survival. Is that what you're talking about? And to whom is that directed? And what kind of outcomes are you looking for, Doctor?
Yes, we have reached out to Congress members a number of times. In fact, in response to their reaching out to us initially, we were asked to consult with a number of Congress members, and we did so December of 2017. But since then, we have not had too many requests. And we find that we also have an independent duty to protect public health, which is a part of our professional responsibility. And as a result, we have made a number of calls after the Muller report was out. When the impeachment proceedings were happening, we felt that the president would engage in dangerous acts, and he has, such as withdrawing troops from northern Syria or commanding the assassination of an Iranian general. And now, under this coronavirus pandemic, we have found it necessary to also alert Congress more urgently than ever, in fact.
And you're suggesting things like invoking the 25th Amendment, which has never been invoked before, that sort of things. But I just want to be clear, when you use the word incapacity, some critics of the president says it's ineptitude. Ineptitude is not a removable offense. You differentiate between someone who's inept and someone who is incapable of performing his or her duties. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, that's right. Ineptitude implies a lack of abilities or ordinary competence. A lack of mental capacity signifies the lack of basic building blocks to be able to make rational, sound, non-impulsive decisions that are based on reality.
I only have a couple of seconds here, but I mentioned at the beginning that you've recently spoken to these child warriors, as you've called them, and say there is ultimately, if things don't go Trump's way, I assume that means if he doesn't win the election, there could be danger in these so-called liberators. What's your concern? By the way, one of your areas of expertise, as I mentioned, is violence. Why do you fear that they'll become violent?
I have observed a lot of dynamics between the president and his followers that duplicate many phenomena I have seen around the world, not so much in this country because, or at least in relation to the government. I have seen it in prisons and in public settings, but I have observed it more abroad, where the government through various psychological techniques, usually not even strategic because it is more based on symptoms and one's impairment. In fact, it would be a mistake to assume that one loses all abilities when one is mentally impaired. When the higher functions are impaired, the lower functions often become more powerful and efficient. And that was what I was seeing between the president and his followers. And I saw what he was doing, calling his followers to liberation, especially when they are suffering from the intense lockdowns and loss of jobs, which the president has induced through his neglect of the problem, or induced in more severe ways. And now he is using that to test his ability to call out his armed troops, if you will, in the case of a greater crisis, a psychological crisis in himself.
Dr. Bandy Lee, on that count, I hope you're wrong, but I really appreciate your analysis and your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.